So our next speaker is no stranger to the Naked Bible audience. He has blogged a good bit as a guest on my website, and we've had him on the podcast before, and of course, ETS and SBL, the videos that we take there. I'd like you to welcome Dr. Ron Johnson, longtime friend, college classmate. We have a long history. we could probably fill up an hour, with good stories, but yeah.
Thank you. Hold the mic. I'll try. Yep. All right. Well, my title explains my goal. I'd like to connect three themes of the Bible together, two of which are well known, and the third which should be. Visually, my title looks like this. The altar on the left represents Old Testament atonement. The cross, of course, is Jesus' death, and the two people on the right are Gentiles. Looking ahead, I'll be recommending in my talk that the order of discussion in the New Testament actually switches these last two ideas around. The cross happens before the question of Gentile inclusion is faced in the early church, but atonement theology as a topic of conversation seems to take place only after Acts 15. So I will first talk about Old Testament atonement, then Gentile inclusion, and then New Testament atonement theology. But in fairness to the bigger story of the Bible, I will start with something that happens before all three of these ideas back in Genesis with Abraham. That atonement, Gentile inclusion, and Jesus' death are sub-stories within another larger narrative of the Bible, at least from the vantage point of the reader. To defend this idea, I would like to, or it would be good to start by comparing what I'm going to say to another way of thinking about atonement. In my own evangelical background, and maybe yours, atonement was described using a diagram where a person stands on one cliff and he wants to get to the other cliff, be that heaven or eternal life. But this person is unable to get to the other side because of the gulf of sin that is in between. In this story, God demands moral perfection in order to cross the chasm. However, and this is often presented as the good news of the gospel, God is willing to offer another way across the gulf. Here the phrase, the finished work of Christ, is often used, and even the word atonement. So in this illustration, it is atonement which provides access to salvation, even accomplishing salvation in some Reformed theologies. The reason I start with this picture is because it is at the same time both very common and very wrong. Atonement in both testaments does not concern the possibility of attaining personal righteousness. It is in reading the Bible left to right as an unfolding drama that this becomes clear, in my opinion. So let's start in the gods of his family in Babylon. We are told in Joshua 24, until he stopped worshiping these gods and instead worshiped the Creator God, whom we know to be Yahweh. And here comes that paradigm-creating statement we find in Genesis 15:6. And Abraham believed in the Lord, and God accounted it to him for righteousness. The word translated as believed is aman, which in its adjectival form means faithful or loyal. And of course, an adjective means that while you are doing something, while you're verbing something, this is how you can be defined. And so it is the state of the person performing the verb of believing in English. Therefore, I would recommend that the story being told goes like this. Abraham loyaled himself to Yahweh as opposed to loyaling himself as he had previously to the gods of Babylon. The New English Translation, the Net Bible, offers a rather free translation here, but I think it is accurate. His response was one of loyalty. As the story of Genesis unfolds from here, main characters are not behavior, but rather in terms of worship or the object of their spiritual loyalties. My favorite story is, in this regard, the interchange between Isaac and Esau in Genesis 27. Each knew that the other worshipped a different deity. So when Isaac asked his son, Esau, "How is it that you found dinner so quickly, my son?" Esau replied, "Because Yahweh, your Elohim," not our Elohim or my Elohim, "brought it to me." Now, of course, that was Jacob, who was trying to sound, smell, and feel like his brother. Atonement plays no role in the Genesis narrative. This is because the setting for which atonement is designed is still missing. The story is showing that people such as Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob can be right with God, tzaddik, righteous, simply through their loyalty to Yahweh and their refusal to worship other gods. When atonement eventually does occur in the story, it's not until Exodus 29, where we are far downstream in the history of God's people. So what does atonement mean, and how is the word used? It is a common English translation of the Hebrew word kafar, which can be translated variously as cover, appease, purge, forgive, and of course atone. The problem with atonement, it's a purely English word, coming from the Latin adunamentum, meaning unity, and translated originally in Old English as one-ment. But again, this is only English, so let's return to the biblical story. Israel had institutionalized sacred space at this point in their history, making a house or tabernacle for Yahweh. God physically lived with Israel, so it was understood, and this meant that Israelites were expected to live by ceremonial cleanliness standards, a theme common to all ancient religions of this period. This is from a recent Biblical Archaeology Review article. Practically every culture distinguishes between clean and unclean things, actions, and people. This is true for simple hygiene as well as for religious or ritual or religious purity. Throughout history, various societies have developed different ways of separating the pure and the impure, usually by imposing restrictions on the movement and behavior of the impure. Given the universality of the idea of impurity, it is not surprising that the Hebrew Bible is full of references to purity and impurity. The widespread attestation of taboo throughout the Bible, along with its near universality and prevalence in the ancient Near East, suggests it was indeed common in ancient Israel. The relevant texts do not attempt to invent the regulations. Rather, they simply reflect a social reality. I offer this citation because the ritual of atonement was also not limited to Israel. Other nations practiced ritual cleansings of many kinds along. So, the picture of getting across was never painted in the Israelite mind. Rather, the desire was to get in, as it were, to be clean, to be ritually sanctified, so that one could enter sacred space and, in some very real sense, be near God in worship. Notice that one's faith or loyalty still preceded the idea of sacred space. This meant, of course, that a person could be right with Yahweh when sacred space was not present or in play. For example, and I think we often forget about this, the average Israelite farmer touched carcasses possibly every day, and this made him ceremonially unclean. But he could still be right with God through his loyalty to Yahweh. It was when he approached the tabernacle that he needed atonement. And of course, exile happened in 586, forcing the Israelite to live on pagan soil without a temple. What was a person like Daniel to do? I believe he simply sang David's psalms and loved God in his mind and actions much as you and I do today. Like Daniel, we are not living in the presence of sacred space. But let's return to the days of Moses and press into the meaning of atonement during a time that Yahweh was understood to live among the Israelites. How did it work? In general, the pattern presented in Leviticus looks like this. When a person approached the tabernacle, a priest required certain rituals to be performed, often involving blood. It was only then that a person could symbolically approach Yahweh in worship or in prayer. In fact, it was the priest, a purified priest at that, who could go into the holy place to represent the prayers of the Israelite. And all of this entire story of atonement ritual, again, only took place in the context of a prior upstream teaching which originated with Abraham. A person's righteousness was not the result of atonement, but a precursor to atonement. Righteousness and ultimate salvation came through loyalty to Yahweh. It is on this point that some of my evangelical friends have hesitated. I should change that to most of my evangelical friends have hesitated. They feel, let me go back actually, I'll show you that in a moment. They feel as though atonement is somehow being diminished in my explanation. When I press them on why that comes up, dealing with ritual purity in the Old Testament, then why did Jesus have to die? This is a strange question to me, quite out of order in the biblical story, and I have often wondered where it comes from. Here is my theory. To quote Tim, I think I'm right, but I might be wrong, but I don't think I am. Here is my theory. See if you agree. This is a page from a book entitled The Life Book, published and distributed by the Gideons, distributed at our Minnesota State Fair this year. As it gets into the meaning of the gospel and how to become a Christian, it begins to talk about Mosaic law. The handwriting you see right here is part of the book, pretending to show how 4 random people are reading the book with you and penciling in their comments along the way. A girl named Taylor here makes the comment, I think maybe we still turn to idols when thinking about the second commandment. Turning the page, we read this: blood payment. Unfortunately, God's laws were broken often. So God gave his people a plan to pay for their law breaking. Because blood is the source of life for all, God's plan for payment involved the spilling of blood. Animals were to be sacrificed as payment for sin and wrongdoing. The curse could not be broken by these sacrifices, but the blood of an animal would provide temporary cover from God's punishment of their sin. Then notice what the author does. Instead of giving biblical support for what he has just said, off to the left he has the pretend teenager say, kind of weird to think that blood somehow made up for sin. I guess it makes more sense of Jesus being killed. More sense? Why would it make more sense for Jesus? I think the author is referring to what I have come to call the, quote, very important reason model for the atonement. It goes like this: Jesus must have died for a very important reason. The biggest reason we can think of is our salvation, which includes the idea that Jesus paid for sin, or hell, and that Jesus also covered God's wrath against sin when he died. Why else would Jesus have died? So goes the argument. This meaning is then taken backwards into Old Testament atonement, leading us to think that this payment was temporary. From here, a U-turn is made, and atonement in the Old Testament foreshadows or predicts the payment of sin later by Jesus. In this way, Jesus dies for the most important reason possible, to fulfill the title of the view, and the Old Testament is refitted to predict it. What we need to hear, of course, is from the front end of the story, asking how atonement worked in the Old Testament, and only then applying this information forward. So let's quickly do that, looking at some representative passages in Leviticus, which talk about the process of atonement. And here's a good sample verse in Leviticus 4:26. So the priest shall make atonement for him concerning his sin. The word there is chata, a common word translated as sin here. And it shall be forgiven him. On the face of it, a man sins. He brings an atoning sacrifice, and he is forgiven. Here's 5:18. So the priest shall make atonement for him regarding his ignorance in which he erred, and did not know it, and it shall be forgiven him. As it turns out, this passage and the preceding one is speaking about sins committed non-rebelliously or without a high hand directed at God. Not just any sin could be solved by atoning sacrifice. 8:15, and Moses poured the blood of the base at the base of the altar and consecrated it to make atonement for it. Here atonement is done for an object, not a person. Fitting the theme of sacred space, the picture is one of ritually cleansing something to make it fit to be used in God's presence. Here is 14:15. Then he shall let the living bird loose outside the city in the open field and make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. Now atonement is even accomplished for a moldy house, declaring it ritually sanctified. Here's 15:15. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. A bodily fluid is here considered kata, or defiling. Lastly, 15:30. And the priest shall make atonement for her before the Lord for the discharge of her uncleanness. And again, atonement is about ritually cleansing someone who is experiencing normal life, this time a female. So we notice then how this kind of verse would never be found in Torah. So the priest shall make atonement for the murderer, and it shall be forgiven him. Why? Why is atonement never offered for big sins like murder or idolatry or adultery? The answer is obvious. Atonement ritual only dealt with defilement caused through sins or situations where non-rebellion or non-rebellious sins are never carefully spelled out in the Old Testament. So what would happen if an already righteous person committed a high-handed sin, such as murder or adultery? Here we can be grateful for the story of David. Apparently dealing with the context of big sins, he said, "Sacrifice and offering you did not desire. My ears you have opened. Burnt offering and sin offering you did not require." Psalm 51 is even more explicit, said to be written in response to the Bathsheba story. "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me." David knew that it would have been wrong, even wicked, to bring an atoning sacrifice to God in order to pay for his sin against Bathsheba and Uriah. Notice what David does next, however. When David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child born to Bathsheba was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. It was after repenting, after acknowledging that there was nothing he could do to pay for his sin, that David ritually cleansed himself in approaching God. The word kafar, or atonement, is not used here, but realize what is consistent. David wants to go in, not across. And he can after he ritually purifies himself. Before moving to the New Testament use of atonement, I would like to summarize what I have said so far in 4 points. Number 1, atonement happens downstream from the Bible's earlier explanation of how to attain personal righteousness. Old Testament ceremonial atonement never claimed to be a means of gaining personal righteousness, nor of generally getting right with God. Number 2, atonement is occasional, prompted by an already righteous Yahweh worshiper who desires to approach the presumed presence, we call it sacred space, of his deity. Where sacred space is lacking, no atonement is needed. Number 3, atonement did not pay for sin nor assuage God's wrath. It sanctified a person from kata, in this case, non-rebellious ritual defilement. Sins of rebellion could only be forgiven through an appeal to God's loving and gracious character. And number 4, atonement welcomed the godly Israelite back into society, granting him full participation with the family of Abraham as a holy individual. This means it was never intended to benefit the Gentile, nor be available to the Gentile so long as he remained Gentile, as Israelite alone. So we are now ready for the New Testament. The apostles knew the story of the Bible. They also believed that a Jew's loyalty to Yahweh, above all other gods, presumed his obedience to Mosaic law, which in turn included the privilege of atonement. Even more specifically, Yahweh had chosen only Abraham's family for eternal blessing and had promised to judge the Gentile nations for their idolatry. In this sense, the Gentile lived under the curse of Torah, principally because of their choice of worship, not because of their poor behavior or lack of obedience. There was a presumed barrier between Jews and Gentiles, something which could only be solved by the Gentile converting to the worship of Yahweh, think Abraham, And just as importantly, conforming to the way of the Jew, even becoming part of the Jewish family, the process of proselytism. But now enter Jesus. He was revolutionary. Jesus gave direct attention to Gentiles, inviting them into the Abrahamic family without the traditional requirement of proselytism. Jesus knew that this was very troubling to his disciples, which is why he probably wore a wry smile when he said, "As the Father has sent me, so send I you." What Jesus had done was to be carried forward. The apostles were expected to tell Gentiles that they could enjoy full participation in the family of Abraham through only their loyalty to Messiah and the God of Israel. Then Jesus leaves, and the book of Acts begins. Immediately, the disciples struggle to believe what Jesus had lived and taught. The barrier went back up. Our best example of this is Peter's reaction to God's request in Acts 10 to visit Cornelius, not at a neutral coffee shop, but in his house. This Gentile probably had never heard of Jesus. Yet Cornelius, who lives in Caesarea, was described as a godly and righteous man, one who feared God with all his household, who gave alms generously and prayed to God always. So here was a man who, along with his wife, was doing precisely what Jesus had invited every Gentile to do. He had turned from the worship of the gods of the Roman and Greek pantheon and come to worship the God of Israel alone. To use evangelical terminology, he was saved and on his way to heaven. So, we are stunned to hear Peter say, "You know how unlawful it is for a Jewish man to keep company with or go to one of another nation." It sounds as though Peter has turned Jesus' ministry on its ear. But then, to his credit, Peter admitted, "God has shown me that I should not call any man common or unclean." Peter was referring to his recent vision of the sheet of unclean animals, and even more so, he was referring to the reason that Gentiles were not to be considered unclean any longer. In truth, he continued, God shows no partiality, but in every nation whoever fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. The realization was astounding. Gentile Yahweh loyalists were now inheritors of the promises at first given only to Abraham. Two families had become one. So I return here to my opening point. In the record of Acts, the argument for the inclusion of believing Gentiles takes place prior to any mention of the atonement of Jesus. And I'm drawing a fine line that very few people do, but I recommend to you. There's a big difference in the Bible between Jesus' death as an event and atonement as a theology. Those are different things. It is not until Paul begins his ministry to Gentiles that a connection is made between Jesus' death and Old Testament atonement. I know that our evangelical tradition has tended to flatten out the story of the New Testament, treating atonement as a ubiquitous idea that is taught everywhere and equally, but the record shows otherwise. It took time and midrashic creativity to connect Jesus' death to the concept of atonement. For remember, Jesus did not die at the altar in Jerusalem, and he died on Passover, not the Day of Atonement. That's the difference in 2019 between April 19th and October 8th. And here's the biggest point of all, really the main point of my paper. Once the connection was made between Jesus' death and the Old Testament, atonement still meant the same thing. It was the way in, the way a person could be ritually cleansed in approaching God after already being righteous. I close by test driving some representative passages in the New Testament to see if this view of atonement works. I could ask the question this way: how would the Bible sound if atonement was about getting in and not getting across, especially for those who had never known the privilege of atonement just because they happened to be Gentile? I think we would hear things like, "Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace." That's the lid of the ark, Psalm 99:1. And we would hear that Jesus suffered for sins that he might bring us to God. We would hear a Gentile audience in Ephesus be told that Jesus' blood brought them near to the court of Israel at the Jerusalem temple, which meant that they were part of the commonwealth of Israel. In hearing about the torn veil of the temple, we would realize that now everyone was allowed entrance to God's living quarters. This is a new and a living way to approach God. There are a few times that the word atonement, or the phrase atoning sacrifice, finds its way into some versions of our English Bibles. In one example, Jesus is the hilasmos for our sins in 1 John 2. Hilasmos connects Jesus back to Old Testament atonement ritual. The Net Bible has atoning sacrifice for hilasmos here. The ESV oddly goes with the Vulgate and reads propitiation. Notice what happens, however. No one wins the argument about the meaning of atonement in 1 John 2 because the verse does not argue for a meaning of atonement. It just says Jesus was the hilasmos for our sins. But notice what it does argue for at the end. Whatever atonement is, now the whole world gets it. The verbal form of hilasmos occurs in Hebrews 2, again connecting Jesus back to Old Testament atonement. We are told he hilaskamide the sins of the people, and once again everyone can use this verse to defend their version of the atonement. But notice the phrase from Hebrews 8 I included next. I will be merciful to their unrighteousness. Interestingly, the Greek word for merciful here is the same word, hilaskamai, in its adjectival form. So if hilaskamai means mercy in chapter 8, what might that say about atonement in chapter 2? The adjectival form of hilaskamai, by the way, in 8 there is helios, defined in our standard Greek dictionary, BDAG, as including the concept of graciousness and mercy. The point to be appreciated is that when we do come across specific language in the New Testament which refers to Jesus' death, and it ties it to the atonement of the Old Testament, which is not often and late, writers consistently opt for words like hilasmos and hilaskamai and helios, which point toward mercy, not payment. Someone was reading this week. I gave it to them, and they said, well, why can't we just have Jesus mercifully then? Just take it out. I want to do that. I want payment, so we load it. We front load that, put back in. Now, how perhaps the most argued verse in the New Testament concerning Jesus' atonement. Here we are told that Jesus was set forth as a hilasterion by his blood. In brief, I agree with the long textual note included in the Net Bible. Hilasterion specifically refers to the mercy place of the Old Testament story, to which the reader's minds were being directed, that is, the mercy seat, the lid on the ark that was sprinkled on the Day of Atonement. And this is Jewish midrash at its best, taking an event like Jesus' crucifixion and weaving it creatively back into a well-known storyline of the Jewish faith. Notice how Paul sees Jesus' death as completing an idea that started with Moses. The privilege of the mercy seat, the ultimate ritual cleansing, was now the privilege of the one who was loyal. Notice the phrase, through loyalty. Paul's argument then is that God was still righteous or acting in propriety for now doing for Gentiles what he had been doing for Jews all along. He had been forgiving their sins, their kata, and making them holy. Through the blood of Christ, believing Gentiles could now also claim atonement for the first time. I wish the Reformation had been to summarize why Jesus came to earth. He came for two reasons: to confirm the promises made to the Jewish fathers and so that the Gentiles could glorify God for his mercy. Let me close by making 4 more points in summary, citing a few verses along the way. Number 5, the principal interest of New Testament writers was not describing how to become righteous, as this was established back in Genesis 15. Their concern was with the reshaping of Abraham's family as believing Gentiles were entering the church while choosing to remain Gentile. Not surprisingly, then, we hear that Jesus died so that he would gather together in one the children of God. To the Galatian Gentiles, Paul would say that his boasting about the cross included the idea that circumcision was now a matter of redundancy, whether for the Jew or the Gentile. To a Gentile audience in Ephesus, Paul could remind them that the cross reconciled two groups of people to God, in the process joining them into one family. To Gentiles in Corinth, Paul could make the offhanded comment that division and crucifixion were mutually opposing ideas in his mind and should be in theirs. Back in Galatia, Paul could argue that claiming Christ as a Gentile resulted in being a member of Abraham's seed and not the other way around. Number 6, I am also claiming here that sanctification in the New Testament generally refers to the effect of Jesus' atonement upon Gentiles as they joined Jews as the holy ones, or the hagioi. I suggest that this sanctification, which was achieved once for all by Jesus' death, was physically confirmed through visits of the Holy Spirit to Gentile congregations in which signs and wonders were present. They could see it. This was Peter's point in Acts 11, just after the Cornelius story, when he saw the Spirit come to Gentiles and realized that this meant that they were being granted repentance to life, meaning that Gentiles, believing Gentiles, would now be physically resurrected along with his own Jewish family and would not be assigned to a separate place in the kingdom, as Jews commonly still think. I have a Jewish friend. We meet for coffee every now and then. She's a Jewess, Orthodox Jew, and kingdom. That's all. Be resurrected, or Acts 11. Peter thinks I'm going to be resurrected with her. So sanctification is not a progressive idea in the New Testament, but like the Old Testament, it referred to a moment in time when someone was ritually cleaned. So this is how the Colossians here would have understood their being made holy or blameless. So too the Gentiles at Corinth could be told that they were called to be hagioi, or holy ones, through this process. They were not naturally holy ones as Jews were, but they came to be holy ones through the death of Jesus, called to this position of favor. We would expect this called idea to show up then in a place like Romans. These Roman Gentile believers were called to become what believing Jews had been by nature. This meant that Gentiles in Ephesus were going to get the inheritance of the family of Abraham. And now we can see why Jews would be so frustrated with Paul's message. He was selling out the Jewish promise of resurrection, turning it into something they never thought it was supposed to mean. This is just on the level of theory for me, but it is possible that in a mixed audience of Jews and Gentiles, Paul could refer to these groups separately, holy ones being Jews and faithful ones referring to Gentiles. I'm just wondering here. Either way, Paul was appealing to one family, new theological territory for his hearers. All right, so what is the relationship between Jesus' death and our salvation? Jesus paid it all. Sin had left a crimson stain. He washed it white as snow. Of course, Jesus' blood is tied to our drawing near to God. These speak of ceremonial cleansing, not getting saved. Forgiveness of sins is not the doorway into Christianity. Worship is. It always has been since the days of Abraham. One verse I should mention with regard to salvation is Hebrews 9:12, which sounds like Jesus' entrance into the holy place resulted in us being delivered eternally, or saved, even some would say. But let's think like the ancient reader. Deliverance language, lutrosis language in Greek, sent the Jewish mind back to the Exodus, to a point and place where God saved Abraham's family from the power of Egypt. This would take another paper to demonstrate, but I believe the evidence points to the bloody Israelite doorposts in Goshen on Passover Eve to be the result of a purification offering that the Israelites performed to mark out their homes as clean or holy. In this way, the destroyer could identify God's special people as his own. This story will be how Jews come to connect deliverance and salvation and ritual purification together. They would say, we were purified that night, and that night we were also saved. Two more points in closing. The curse of the law, number 7, was not Torah's demand for behavioral perfection, but Paul's reminder to a Gentile congregation that their attempt to keep Torah required that they see themselves as cursed just for being Gentile. This is what the Torah said, or at least included, going all the way back to Genesis 12, where the word curse initially was attached to Gentiles. Paul later told the Galatians, of course, that Jesus took this curse of the Gentile upon himself. He doesn't say how, he just says he did. So that, and this is the main point of his argument, Paul says, the blessing of Abraham might come upon the Gentiles. And this leads to my last point, this kind of creative theology on the part of Paul. Number 8, the fact that Jesus' crucifixion did not meet several requirements of Old Testament atonement. Remember, he dies outside the temple. He did not die on the Day of Atonement. His body was beaten. Jews have a long list of reasons not to believe that Jesus was matching an Old Testament atonement model, and they're right. Did not prohibit midrashic creativity on the part of New Testament authors. I realize I have too many negatives there when I reread that. So what I'm trying to say is get ready for creative thinking on the part of the New Testament writer. And they love to do this. This is Jewish. Here is my favorite example. I think someone used the phrase repurposing biblical material. Maybe that was Mike or Tim. By the way, this is slide number 100. My last one. What should we do with the fact that Jesus died outside the gates of Jerusalem, overlooking a garbage dump? Jews commonly bring this up as a reason to not believe in the atonement of Jesus. Paul would have made a great missional pastor. He would have said, no problem. Since Jesus died outside the gate, let's use this as a point of mission to our Gentile friends. Thank you, and I look forward to improving on these thoughts with your help.
I'm sure you won't get any questions after that. That's QA@nakedbible.com. Subject line. No, that was quite good. If you've caught, I guess it was last year, but maybe even the last 2 years, when Carl and you and myself at ETS and SBL, we would do our little sit-down thought experiment. Again, you could see some of that back then. It has now sort of developed and germinated into this, and of course the posts on the website. But I'm not going to intrude with any questions. Okay, I lie. Okay, in your talk with your Jewish friend, why do they need to become a follower of Jesus?
That first half of Romans. Yeah, that first half of Romans 15:8 and 9 to confirm the promises made to the fathers. I said to her, Paul believed, he's a Jew, he believed that Jesus came for two things. One for me, for my mercy, my atonement, but for you, you've got to believe he's the promise, because he's the beloved one. I mean, we talked about being, that famous line. That was big to Paul.